The Treasure Seekers, Chapter 5. The Poet and the Editor. It was not bad sport, being in London entirely on our own hook. We asked the way to Fleet Street, where Father says all the newspaper offices are. They said straight on down Ludgate Hill, but it turned out to be quite another way. At least we didn't go straight on. We got to St. Paul's. Noel would go in, and we saw where Gordon was buried, at least the monument. It is very flat, considering that what a man he was. When we came out, we walked a long way, and when we asked a policeman, he said we'd better go through Smithfield. So we did. And they don't burn people any more there now, so it was rather dull, besides being a long way, and Noel got very tired. He's a peaky little chap. It comes of being a poet, I think. He had a bun or two at different shops, out of the shillings, and it was quite late in the afternoon when we got to Fleet Street. The gas was lighted, and the electric lights. There is a jolly Bovril sign that comes off and on in different colored lamps. We went to the Daily Record office and asked to see the editor. It is a big office, very bright, with brass and mahogany and electric lights. They told us the editor wasn't there, but at another office, so we went down a dirty street to a very dull-looking place. There was a man there inside, in a glass case, as if he was a museum, and he told us to write down our names and our business, so Oswald wrote. Oswald Bastable, Noel Bastable, business very private indeed. Then we waited on the stone stairs. It was very draughty, and the man in the glass case looked at us as if we were the museum instead of him. We waited a long time, and then a boy came down and said the editor can't see you. Will you please write your business? And he laughed. I wanted to punch his head, but Noel said, Yes, I'll write it if you'll give me a pen and ink and a sheet of paper and an envelope. The boy said he'd better write by post, but Noel, in a bit pig-headish way, and it's his worst fault, he said, No, I'll write it now. So I backed him up by saying, Look at the price penny stamp, are since the coal strike. So the boy grinned, and the man in the glass case gave us pen and paper, and Noel wrote. Oswald writes better than he does, but Noel would do it, and it took a very long time, and then it was inky. Dear Mr. Editor, I want you to print my poetry and pay for it, and I am a friend of Mrs. Leslie's. She is a poet too. Your affectionate friend, Noel Bastable. He licked the envelope a good deal so that the boy shouldn't read it going upstairs, and he wrote, Very private, outside, and gave the letter to the boy. I thought it wasn't any good, but in a minute the grinning boy came back, and he was quite respectful and said, The editor says, please, will you step up? We stepped up. There were a lot of stairs and passages and odd sorts of humming, hammering sounds and very funny smells. The boy was now very polite, and said it was the ink we smelled, and the noise was the printing machines. After going through a lot of cold passages, we came to a door. The boy opened it and let us in. That was a large room with a big, soft blue and red carpet and a roaring fire, though it was only October, and a large table with drawers, and littered with paper just like the one in Father's study. A gentleman was sitting at one side of the table. He had a light mustache and light eyes, and he looked very young to be an editor, not nearly so old as Father. He looked very tired and sleepy, as if he had got up very early in the morning, but he was kind, and we liked him. Oswald thought he looked clever. Oswald is considered a judge of faces. Well, said he, so you are Mrs. Leslie's friends. I think so, said Noel. At least she gave us each a shilling, and she wished us good hunting. Good hunting, eh? Well, what about the poetry of yours? Which is the poet? I can't think how he could ask that. Oswald is said to be a very manly-looking boy of his age. However, I thought it would look duffing to be offended, so I said, "This is my brother Noel. He is the poet." Noel had turned quite pale. The editor told us to sit down, and he took the poems from Noel and began to read them. Noel got paler and paler. I really thought he was going to faint, like he did when I held his hand under the cold water tap after I had accidentally cut him with my chisel. Then the editor had read the first poem. It was the one about the beetle. He got up and stood with his back to us. It was no manners, but Noel thinks he did it to conceal his emotions. So they do in books. He read all the poems, and then he said, "I like your poetry very much, young man. I will give you, let's see, how much shall I give for it?" "As much as ever you can," said Noel. "You see, I want a good deal of money to restore the fallen fortunes of the house of Bastable." The gentleman put on some eyeglasses and looked hard at us. Then he sat down. "That's a good idea," he said. "Tell me how you came to think of it. And I say, have you had any tea? They've just sent out for mine." He rang a tiny bell, and the boy brought in a tray with a teapot and a thick cup and saucer and things, and he had to fetch another tray for us when he was told to, and we had tea with the editor of the Daily Recorder. I suppose it was a very proud moment for Noel, though I did not think of it till afterward. The editor asked us a lot of questions, and he told him a very good deal, though, of course, I did not tell a stranger all our reasons for thinking that the family fortune wanted restoring. We stayed about half an hour, and when we were going away, he said again, "I shall print all your poems, my poet, and now what do you think they're worth?" "I don't know," said Noel. "You see, I didn't write them to sell." "Why did you write them then?" he asked. Noel said he didn't know. He supposed because he wanted to. "Art for art's sake, said the editor, and he seemed quite delighted, as though Noel had said something clever. "Well, would a guinea meet your views?" he asked. "I have read of people being at a loss for words, and dumb with emotion, and I've read of people being turned to stone with astonishment, or joy, or something, but I never knew how silly it looked till I saw Noel standing there, staring at the editor with his mouth open. He went red, and he went white, and then he got crimson, as if he were rubbing more and more crimson like on a palette. But he didn't say a word, so Oswald had to say, "I should jolly well think so." So the editor gave Noel a sovereign and a shilling, and he shook hands with us both, but he thumped Noel on the back and said, "Buck up, old man. It's your first guinea, but it won't be your last. Now go along home, and in about 10 years you can bring me some more poetry. Not before, see? I'm just taking the poetry of yours because I like it very much, but we don't put poetry in this paper at all. I shall have to put it in another paper I know of." "What do you put in your paper?" I asked, for father always takes the Daily Chronicle, and I didn't know what the Recorder was like. "We chose it because it was such a glorious office, and a clock outside lighted up." "Oh, news," he said, "and dull articles, things about celebrities, if you know any celebrities now." Noel asked him what celebrities were. "Oh, the Queen, the Princess, the people with titles, and people who write songs or act or do something clever or wicked." "I don't know anybody wicked," said Oswald, wishing he had known Dick Turpin or Claude Duval, so as to be able to tell the editor things about them. "But I know someone with a title, Lord Tottenham." "The mad old protectionist, How did you come to know him?" "We don't know him to speak to, but he goes over the heath every day at 3, and he strides along like a giant, with black cloak like old Tennyson's flying behind him, and he talks to himself like 1 o'clock. What does he say? The editor had sat down again, and he was fiddling with a blue pencil. We only heard him once, close enough to understand, and then he said, "The curse of the country, sir, ruin and desolation," and then he went striding along again, hitting at the furze bushes as if they were the heads of his enemies. "Excellent descriptive touch," said the editor. "Well, go on. That's all I know about him, except that he stops in the middle of the heath every day, and he looks all round to see if there's anyone about, and if there isn't, he takes his collar off." The editor interrupted, which is considered rude, and he said, "You're not romancing." "I beg your pardon?" said Oswald. "Drawing the longbow, I mean," said the editor. Oswald drew himself up, and he said he was not a liar, and the editor only laughed and said romancing and lying were not at all the same, only it was important to know what you were playing at. So Oswald accepted his apology and went on. "We were hiding among the furze bushes one day, and we saw him do it. He took off his collar, and he put on a clean one, and he threw the other among the bushes. We picked it up afterward, and it was a beastly paper one." "Thank you," said the editor, and he got up and put his hand in his pocket. "That's well worth 5 shillings, and there you are. Would you like to see round the printing office before you go home?" I pocketed my 5 bob and thanked him, and I said we should like it very much, and he called another gentleman and said something we couldn't hear. Then he said good-bye again, and all this time Newell hadn't said a word. But now he said, "I've made a poem about you. It is called Lines to a Noble Editor. Shall I write it down?" The editor gave him the blue pencil, and he sat down at the editor's table and wrote. It was this, he told me afterwards, as well as he could remember. "May life's choicest blessings be your lot. I think you ought to be very blessed, for you are going to print my poems, and you may have this one as well as the rest." "Thank you," said the editor. "I don't think I ever had a poem addressed to me before. I shall treasure it, I assure you." Then the other gentleman said something, and we went off to see the printing office with at least £1.7 in our pockets. It was good hunting, and no mistake. But we never put Noel's poetry in the Daily Record. It was quite a long time afterward we saw a sort of story thing in a magazine on the station bookstall, and that kind, sleepy-looking editor had written it, I suppose. It was not at all amusing. It said a lot about Noel and me, describing us all wrong, and saying how we had tea with the editor, and all Noel's poems were in the story thing. And I think myself the editor seemed to make a game of them, but Noel was quite pleased to see them printed, so that all was right. It wasn't my poetry anyway, and I am glad to say. Chapter 6. Noel's Princess. She happened quite accidentally. We were not looking for a princess at all just then, but Noel had said he was going to find a princess all by himself and marry her. And he really did, which was rather odd because when people say things are going to befall, very often they don't. It was different, of course, with the prophet of old. We did not get any treasure by it except 12 chocolate drops. What we might have done, and it was an adventure anyhow. Greenwich Park is a jolly good place to play in, especially the parts that aren't near Greenwich. The part near the heath are first-rate, and I often wish the park was nearer our house. I suppose a park is a different and difficult thing to move. Sometimes we get Eliza to put a lunch in a basket, and we go up to the park. She likes that. It saves cooking dinner for us. And sometimes she says of her own accord, "I've made some pastries for you, and you might as well go into the park, too. That's a lovely day outside." She always tells us to rinse out the cup at the drinking fountain, and the girls do, but I always put my head under the tap and drink. Then you are an intrepid hunter at a mountain stream, and besides, you're sure it's clean. Dickie does the same, and so does H.O., but Noel always drinks out of the cup. He says it's a golden goblet wrought by enchanted gnomes. The day that Princess happened was a fine, hot day last October, and we were quite tired with the walk up the park. We always got in by the little gate at the top of the Crooms Hill. It is the postern gate that things always happen at in stories. It was dusty walking, but then we got to the park and it was ripping, so we rested a bit and lay on our backs and looked up at the trees and wished we could play monkeys. I had done it before now, but the park keeper makes a row if he catches you. When we'd rested a little, Alice said, "It was a long way to the enchanted wood, but it's very nice now we are here. I wonder what we shall find in it." "We shall find deer," said Dickie, "if we go to look, but they go on the other side of the park because of the people with buns." Saying buns made us think of lunch. So we had it, and when we had done, we scratched a hole under a tree and buried the papers, because we know it spoils pretty places to leave beastly, greasy papers laying about. I remember Mother teaching me and Dora that when we were quite little. I wish everybody's parents would teach them this useful lesson, and the same thing about orange peels. When we'd eaten everything there was, Alice whispered, "I see the white witch bear yonder among the trees. Let's track it and slay it in its lair." "I am the bear," said Noel, so he crept away, and we followed him among the trees. Often the witch bear was out of sight, and then you didn't know where it would jump out at you, but sometimes we saw it and just followed it. "When we catch it, there'll be a great fight," said Oswald, "and I shall be Count Folko of Mount Faucon." "I'll be Gabriel," said Dora. "She is the only one of us who likes doing girls' parts." "I'll be Sintram," said Alice, "and H.O. can be the little master. What about Dickie?" "Oh, I can be the pilgrim with the bones." "Hist!" whispered Alice. "See his white, furry mane gleaming amid yonder covert." I saw a bit of white, too. It was Noel's collar, and it had come undone in the back. We hunted the bear in and out of the trees, and then we lost him altogether, and suddenly we found the wall of the park, in a place where, I'm sure, there wasn't a wall before. Noel wasn't anywhere about, and there was a door in the wall, and it was open, so we went through. The bear had hidden himself, and these mountain fastnesses. Oswald said, "I will draw my good sword and after him." So I drew the umbrella, which Dora always will bring in case it rains, because Noel gets a cold on the chest at the least thing, and we went on. The other side of the wall was a stable yard, all cobblestone, and there was nobody about, but we could hear a man rubbing down a horse and hissing in the stable. So we crept very quietly past, and Alice whispered, "'Tis the lair of the monster serpent. I hear his deadly hiss. Beware, courage, and dispatch." We went over the stones on tiptoe, and we found another wall with another door in it on the other side. We went through it, too, on tiptoe. It really was an adventure, and there were in the shrubbery. We saw something white through the trees. Dora said it was the white bear. That is so like Dora. She always begins to take part in a play just when the rest of us are getting tired of it. I don't mean this unkindly, because I am very fond of Dora. I cannot forget how kind she was when I had bronchitis, and ingratitude is a dreadful vice, but it is quite true. "It is not a bear," said Oswald, and we all went on, still on tiptoe. round a twisty path and onto a lawn, and there was Noel. His collar had come undone, and so I said he had an inky mark on his face that he had made just before we left the house, and he wouldn't let Dora wash it off, and one of the bootlaces was coming down. He was standing looking at a little girl. She was the funniest little girl you ever saw. She was like a china doll, the sixpenny kind. She had a white face and long yellow hair down up very tight in two pigtails. Her forehead was very big and lumpy. Her cheeks came high up, like little shelves under her eyes. Her eyes were small and blue. She had on a funny black frock with curly braid on it and button boots that went almost up to her knees. Her legs were very thin, and she was sitting in a hammock chair nursing a blue kitten. Not a sky blue one, of course, but the color of a new slate pencil. And we came up. We heard her say to Noel, "Who are you?" Noel had forgotten about the bear, and he was taking his favorite part, so he said, "I am Prince Camaralzaman." The funny little girl looked pleased. "I thought at first you were a common boy," she said. Then she saw the rest of us and said, "Are you all princesses and princes, too?" "Of course we are, yes." And she said, "I am a princess also." She said it very well, too, exactly as if it were true. We were very glad because it is so seldom you meet any children who can begin to play right off without having everything explained to them first. And even then they will say they are going to pretend to be a lion or a witch or a king. Now this little girl just said, "I am a princess." And then she looked at Oswald and said, "I fancy I've seen you at Baden." Of course Oswald said, "Very likely." The little girl had a funny voice, and all her words were quite plain, each word by itself. She didn't talk at all like we do. H.O. asked her what the cat's name was, and she said, "Katinka." Then Dickie said, "Let's go away from the windows. If you play near the windows, someone inside generally knocks at them and says, 'Don't.'" The princess put down the cat very carefully and said, "I am forbidden to walk off the grass." "That's a pity," said Dora. "But I will, if you like," said the princess. "You mustn't do things you are forbidden to do," Dora said, but Dickie showed us that there was some more grass beyond the shrubs and only a gravel path between, so I lifted the princess over the gravel so that she should be able to say that she hadn't walked off the grass. When we got to the other grass, we all sat down, and the princess asked us if we liked degrees. I know that's how you spell it, for I asked Albert's uncle next door. We said we thought not, but she pulled out a real silver box out of her pocket and showed us. They were just flat, round chocolates. We had 2 each, and then we asked her name, and she began, and then she went on and on and on, till I thought she was never going to stop. H.O. said she had 50 names, but Dickie is very good at figures, and he says there were only 8. The first were Pauline, Alexandra, Alice, Mary was 1, and Victoria, for we all heard that, and it ended up with Hildegard, Kunigunde, and something or other, princess of something else. When she'd done, H.O. said, "That's jolly good, say it again," and she did, but even then we couldn't remember it. We told her our names, but she thought they were too short. So, when it was Noel's turn, he said that he was Prince Noel Camaralzaman, Ivan, Constantine, Charlemagne, James, John, Edward, Biggs, Maximilian, Bastable, Prince of Lewisham. But when she asked him to say it again, of course, he could only get the first 2 names right because he'd made it up as he went on. So the princess said, "You're quite old enough to know your own name." She was very grave and serious. She told us that she was 5th cousin of Queen Victoria. We asked who the other cousins were, but she did not seem to understand. She went on and said she was 7 times removed. She couldn't tell us what that meant either, but Oswald thinks it means that the Queen's cousins are so fond of her that they will keep coming bothering. So the Queen's servants have orders to remove them, and this little girl must have been very fond of the Queen to try so often to see her, and to have been 7 times removed. We could see that it considered something to be proud of, but we thought it was hard on the Queen that her cousin wouldn't let her alone. Presently the little girl asked us where our maids and governesses were. We told her we hadn't any just now, and she said, "How pleasant! And did you come here alone?" "Yes," said Dora. "We come across the heath." "You are very fortunate," said the little girl. She sat very upright on the grass, with her fat little hands in her lap. "I should like to go on the heath. There are donkeys there with white saddle covers, and I should like to ride them, but my governess will not permit." "I'm glad we haven't a governess," said H.O. "We ride the donkey whenever we have pennies, and once I gave the man another penny to make it gallop." "You are indeed fortunate," said the princess again, and when she looked sad, the shelves of her cheeks showed more than ever. "You could have laid a 6pence on them quite safely, if you had had one." "Never mind," said Newell. "I've got a lot of money. Come out and have a ride now." But the little girl shook her head and said she was afraid it would not be correct. Dora said she was quite right then. All of a sudden came one of those uncomfortable times when nobody can think of anything to say. So we sat and looked at each other, but at last Alice said we ought to be going. "Do not go yet," said the little girl. "At what time did you order your carriage?" "Our carriage is a fairy one, drawn by griffins, and it comes when we wish it to," said Noel. The little girl looked at him very oddly and said, "That is out of a picture book." Then Noel said he thought it was about time he was married if we were to be home in time for tea. The little girl was rather stupid over it, but she did what she was told. And we married them with Dora's pocket handkerchief for a veil, and the ring off the back of one of the buttons on H.O.'s shirt just went on her little finger. Then we showed her how to play cross-touch and puss in the corner and tag. It was very fun, and she didn't know any games but battledore and shuttlecock. But she really began to laugh at last, and not to look quite such like a doll. She was Puss, and was running after Dickie when, suddenly, she stopped short and looked as if she was going to cry. And we looked too, and there were 2 prim ladies with little mouths and tight hair. One of them said, in quite an awful voice, "Pauline, who are these children?" And her voice was gruff, with very curly R's, and the little girl said we were princesses and princes, which was silly to grown-up persons. "That is not a great friend of yours." The gruff lady gave a short, horrid laugh, like a husky bark, and said, "Princes, indeed! They're only common children." Dora turned very red and began to speak, but the little girl cried out, "Common children! Oh, I'm so glad! When I am grown up, I'll always play with common children." And she ran at us and began to kiss us, one by one, beginning with Alice. She had got to H.O. when the horrid lady said, "Your Highness, go indoors at once." The little girl answered, "I won't." Then the prim lady said, "Wilson, carry her Highness indoors." And the little girl was carried away screaming and kicking, with her little thin legs and her buttoned boots. And between her screams she shrieked, "Common children! I'm glad, glad, glad! Common children! Common children!" The nasty lady then remarked, "Go at once, or I will send for the police." So we went. H.O. made a face at her, and so did Alice. But Oswald took off his cap and said he was very sorry if she was annoyed about anything, for Oswald has always been taught to be polite to ladies, however nasty they are. Dickie took off his, too, when he saw me do it. He says he did it first, but that is a mistake. If I were really a common boy, I should say it was a lie. Then we all came away, and we got outside. Dora said, "So she really was a princess. Fancy, a princess living there." "Even princesses have to live somewhere," said Dickie. "And I thought it was play, and it was real. I wish I'd known. I should have liked to ask her lots of things," said Alice. H.O. said he would have liked to ask her what she had for dinner and whether she had on a crown. I felt myself we had lost a chance of finding out a great deal about kings and queens. I might have known such a stupid-looking little girl would never have been able to pretend as well as that. So we all went home across the heath and made dripping toast for tea. Then we were eating it, and Noel said, "I wish I could have given her something. It is very good." He sighed as he said it, and his mouth was very full, so we know he was thinking of his princess. He says now that she was as beautiful as the day, but we remember her quite well, and she was nothing of that kind.